Scientific Imagination is part of the Future-Based platform. My name is Sabine Winters. For more information, visit scientificimagination.org. Welcome to this podcast of Scientific Imagination. Already the 9th episode of this podcast series, and this time with Angelo Vermeulen. Angelo, welcome. Angelo is a space researcher, biosystems engineer, biologist and artist, and he co-founded SEADS, an international transdisciplinary collective of artists, scientists, engineers and activists. Its goal is to reshape the future through critical inquiry and hands-on experimentation. Biomod is one of their most well-known art projects and consists of a worldwide series of interactive art installations. For the last 10 years, Angelo has been collaborating with the European Space Agency MELISA program on the biological life support for space. In 2013, he became a crew commander of the first NASA-funded high seas Mars simulation in Hawaii, and currently he works at the Delft University of Technology, developing bio-inspired concepts for interstellar exploration. And Angelo is also preparing a series of art science experiments on board of the International Space Station. Furthermore, Angelo is a senior TED fellow and was selected in 2017 as one of the top 5 tech pioneers from Belgium by the newspaper the Tijd. So again, Angelo, welcome and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Your career has quite a broad scope. Could you explain what was your biggest motivation to follow this path throughout your study and career?
Yes, I'm active in different fields. I'm both a scientist and a visual artist, a community organizer, just like you. I've always had these interests. It's not like I transitioned from one to the other. I've always had multiple interests. Like many young people have multiple interests, but instead of choosing one career path, I got more and more interested to build connections. And I think that's really what it boils down to. If I have to summarize how I look at myself, I think 2 things really stand out. I'm an explorer and I'm a connector. I really love to build connections between many aspects of life. For example, that's one of the reasons that I'm a community organizer, a global community organizer. I love to connect people, to connect ideas, to connect cultures, and to see what comes out of that. And the exploration is not just exploring the world. I mean, not in a traditional sense. I look at the arts as another way of exploring the world. So it's really this broad set of skills, this broad set of interests that I use to step into the world, to be part of the world, to explore it, and then to start connecting things.
Wow, super inspiring. And the topic we are going to explore today is imagination and the role of imagination in your profession. But first, you recently presented the Biomodd in Bruges, Belgium. Could you elaborate a little bit more about the SEADS network and the project of Biomodd?
I'm active as part of the SEADS collective that I co-founded. We're a collective of artists, scientists, engineers, activists, all working together globally. And Biomodd is actually our longest running project. And the main interest in Biomodd is really to question how we imagine the relationship between nature and technology. And if we could reimagine those relationships. That's the core goal of the project. And very specifically, what we do in the project is we start from e-waste, old computers that people throw away, and we show communities all over the world how you can disassemble that e-waste, figure out which components are still working, and then we show how you can build functioning computer units with those computer components. So basically, upcycling e-waste into functioning computer units, and then we assemble those computer units into functioning networks, computer networks in a kind of sculptural setup. And then crucial for Biomodd, we integrate living ecosystems inside the electronics, inside these computer networks. And we try to build different types of relationships between the ecosystems, the artificial ecosystems, and the computer electronics. And one of the ways in which we do this is, for example, by capturing the waste heat of the electronics. All computers produce a lot of waste heat, but instead of trying to get rid of it, we capture the waste heat and we create tropical microclimates in which we grow particular plants, tropical plants and other organisms. And so we boost the growth of these ecosystems using that waste heat. We also have been using single-celled microalgae. What we do is we water cool some of the computers, but instead of using toxic coolant liquid, we actually use a living culture of microalgae. We pump a living culture of microalgae through the computers. And so that culture of algae is physically cooling the processors of the computers. And so you end up with a very interesting symbiosis between a motherboard and single-celled algae. The single-celled algae grow better because of the heat, and the motherboard operates because of the presence of the cooling the algae. And it's this kind of shift of imagination, because of course, for many people, technology and ecology are pretty much opposite. And it's not like in Biomod we want to turn technology into something innocent. That's definitely not our goal. But our interest is in trying to open up our established ideas about that relationship. And in later versions of Biomod, we started deepening that kind of potential relationship between nature and technology, and we started exploring the use of robotics and sensors. And for example, in the latest Biomod in Bruges, we've included, apart from plants and algae, we've also included bacteria. And so by using an array of sensors, we're sensing all kinds of signals from the plants and the bacteria. And these are used in the computer game that is running on the network. Because Biomod is actually a framework for a multiplayer computer game. It's a framework for social interaction. But once you enter the game, you're actually joining in with other organisms, other non-human agents that are also present in the game. And so the whole project really becomes a project in which we fuse social, technical, and ecological systems. But I think, and this is something that I'm generally interested in, is we are limited in our imagination. We're limited in our understanding how things relate to each other, how things work. And we are all children of our time. And how on earth do we break through that gridlock? That's just what fascinates me deeply. This also comes back in science fiction, where when you look at science fiction in its own time, in its own context, if you look at science fiction from the 19th century, for example, you see basically a mashup of contemporary technologies and promising technologies all put together. And that's like the representation of the future. They couldn't envision anything or hardly anything what we have today. I mean, in some ways, conceptually, but never the final look of it or the final configuration of it. And then I'm wondering, of course, today is the same thing. We're still in that gridlock. We're still not capable to imagine the world, how it would look like in 100 years. It's very difficult. But then as an artist, this becomes a very interesting challenge. And so to go back to Biomod, we have these ideas on how nature and technology relate. Can we break this open? Can we open up that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Is multidisciplinary approach to your research connected with breaking through or opening up possibilities of the future? And what is the role of imagination in this multidisciplinary approach?
The multidisciplinary approach, of course, creates diversity. And it's this diversity of perspectives, and especially the meeting of different perspectives, sometimes the clashing of different perspectives, that actually stimulates imagination, if done well, if people truly connect. I mean, every profession, every specialty, of course, has its own background, its own legacy, which you step into and you're shaped by it, which is good. This enables you to go really deep in a particular field. But at the same time, of course, it's constraining. Everybody knows this. I mean, we're talking about artists and scientists. We all have this. We move into a specific scientific field, we zoom in, and this becomes our specialty. And it's not easy to keep that broader perspective all the time. I mean, you can try to keep up with other scientific domains, but there is a limit to it. And not every scientist is good at it. Some scientists are really good at zooming in, and that's what they're strong at. And other scientists are a bit, they think a bit broader, in broader terms. It's the same thing with the arts. If you're a painter, a contemporary painter today, my God, what a challenge, right? You have that massive history of painting behind you. How are you going to position yourself against that? While if somebody who comes out of a different artistic field, or even a scientist starts painting with less background, this might actually be enabling. So I think the combination of these different perspectives of meeting of people that have slightly different viewpoints, and then really making that work, making that communication work, well, then you really can move imagination forward. My experience is that it's not like it happens in an instant. Suddenly it's all there and the imagination just goes crazy. Imagination is something that needs to be gradually cultivated. And it's something, and this imaginary world that you're developing as a group of the high diversity is something that is crafted over time. It's not like suddenly the entire concept is there. Now, the thing is, why is this diversity so crucial when we're thinking about stimulating imagination and moving imagination forward? We're talking about collective intelligence here. Mm-hmm. That's really what it is. By bringing together these different perspectives, and I'm talking about different disciplines, and not just within the sciences or within engineering, but really engineering, science, art, different disciplines. I'm talking about cultural differences, bringing different cultural perspectives together, gender, age, really on many levels, bringing together diversity, which is what we do with SEADS. If you manage to unlock the collective intelligence of that group, then of course you have a huge potential to come up with very interesting new proposals. Now, unlocking that collective intelligence is not trivial. It's not like you put people together and magic happens. All these things need facilitation. And it requires an interesting kind of leadership. I think that's what it really boils down to. It doesn't mean that it has to be done by one single person. Leadership can be a group of people. But that's my experience. People that are really sensitive to the processes that are happening, and especially sensitive to the communication dynamics that are happening within the group, and constantly pick up where miscommunication happens, where disconnection happens, and constantly work on the cohesion of the group. And that's something that I took away from my experience living in a Mars simulation, where as a commander, my guiding principle was crew cohesion. That's what I was trying to maximize every single day. And elements like friendship are really key. Mm-hmm. When people become friends, they become fascinated with each other's backgrounds, each other's views on life, then these connections can happen. And like I said, you can unlock so much more. Now, this is quite a contrast with how our educational system works, of course, and how children are brought up. I always use the example of the archetypical question that children are being asked: what do you want to become when you grow up? Already there, in that specific question, you're forcing that child to make a singular choice or a series of singular choices. You're never inviting a kid to ask, hey, what kind of combination of interests do you want to bring about? Of course not. That's just nobody will ask that. And let me be clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong with monodisciplinarity. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But some people are really good at, like I said before, at zooming in, at being very specialized. And we need specialists, people that go really, really deep. But we also need to allow people that have those multiple interests to develop those, and especially to build those connections. That's just my personal experience of always having had those interests and then gradually developing all those interests.
There are already many, many topics that you touched upon here, will we come back to later. But when we think about imagination in philosophy, there's debate on what the definition of imagination is. Probably we'll never come to a conclusive answer. But if you have to give a definition of imagination, would it then be a collective intelligence?
No, I wouldn't define imagination in terms of collectivism or community. I mean, your imagination, of course, obviously is shaped by your surroundings. But the question is, if your surroundings would be minimized, would you still have imagination? But
that's a super interesting question. Would you?
Yeah. What kind of images would you have if you're brought up without hardly any input? If you would be brought up on the moon as a baby, and you would never see anything about Earth, just what's up there in the sky. If you would make your first trip to Earth, you would be shocked, of course, because you would have never expected things to look like they do. One of the things that I find very interesting in terms of this thought experiment is the phenomenon or the theory of biophilia, where it's the idea that we are attracted to nature innately, that it's really inside of us to be attracted to nature, that it's like hardwired, coded into our genes. And I would wonder if somebody who was born on the moon never saw anything of Earth except looking at Earth in the sky, and I would arrive on Earth, whether that person would feel that same urge, that same connection with nature, or the person would become very melancholic and start longing for the gray, dusty fields of the moon, right? Is that idea that nature is so deeply human, that our connection with nature is so deeply human, and it really defines us. Is that a construct? Is it a cultural construct? Is it because we are growing up in a world where there's a lot of green around us? Or is it something that is really coded into our genes? I think it might be coded, which is quite interesting in itself. Because when we think about imagination, imagining the world and the natural world is a big part of that. I mean, of course, we imagine many things, But I think if you look at human culture, imagining landscapes and better worlds, pre-climate change worlds, and it is this kind of Garden of Eden dream is driving a lot of our societal dynamics. The whole climate science debate, and even the debate on why Corona happened in the first place, it always goes back to that massive presence of the imagination of the natural world. And so for me, of course, as a space scientist, it becomes interesting to see what would happen in outer space when nature would be something entirely different.
Yes. And in what way then does imagination allows an experimental space for discovery?
I mean, you can't disconnect both, right? I mean, I cannot imagine a scientist working without imagination. How on earth would that work? When you're designing the experiments, that's when the imagination is at work, of course, because you're really thinking of all possible caveats and possible mistakes that you could make if you wouldn't include this condition, if your control condition wouldn't be like this and this. You're designing the experiment and then you're constantly verifying using your imagination whether this will answer your question in a trustworthy way, right? Here, the imagination is already a key element. And of course, before you even set up the experiment, you need to come up with a new theory, or you want to falsify some theory. And of course, for that, once again, imagination is needed. So I always find it interesting when people make a distinction between artists and scientists, and they somehow move the concept of creativity towards the artist. Mm-hmm. And I'm always like, why do you do that? Why is this idea that artists are creative and then engineers and scientists are like not creative? I mean, show me one successful scientist who is not creative. But of course, it's because the idea of creativity it's a definition of creativity. For a lot of people, creativity is like this. It has a lot to do with freedom, just expressing yourself. The archetypical image of a painter is somebody splashing paint against the wall. Of course, creativity is not just splashing paint against the wall. There is a lot of thought and a lot of creativity, and there is a lot of consideration. And that consideration and that thought that is also part of creativity, it's a dialectic relationship, of course. It's the imagination that drives the thinking, and then the thinking is driving the imagination into a different direction, but then you realize something. And then the third component is really the trying out, because I really think it's very difficult to disentangle all of those three elements. It's the imagination through which some images of our ideas emerge, then the thinking, which you start thinking things through, the thought experiment, which is less intuitive, of course, you start making logical steps, and then grabbing a piece of paper and starting to sketch a few things. And then those three things are constantly working with each other. This is nothing new. We all know this. We all have experienced this, but this is really what it is. So it's a little tricky to grab imagination and to pull it out of its dynamic context and then to try to talk about it. I really think you need to keep it embedded in its dynamic context.
Yes, I'm going to try anyway. I really want to focus on, for example, the differences between creativity and imagination, or at least the role of creativity and imagination. Of course, there's this danger that you will end up in a semantic discussion, which I really want to avoid. Going back to your works and the role of imagination in your profession, I'm really interested in the project of the biological spaceship. Could you elaborate on this project and maybe also apply description that you gave of the role of imagination?
So the project is called Evolving Asteroid Starships. It's my research project at Delft University of Technology. It's been running for a number of years. There's a couple of conference papers that have been published about the project. The project was essentially starting from my interest in interstellar exploration, the next stage of space exploration beyond the solar system. I'm not talking about intergalactic sci-fi kind of exploration, really talking about exploring nearby stars, which technically is feasible. Stars that are like between 4 to 8 light years away from Earth. This is technically feasible. I mean, not right now, but it's definitely within the boundaries of what we understand of physics right now. And there are two components to it. The first component is that when you would ask a random person in the street to come up with a description of how they envision a starship, they will probably come up with either Star Trek or Star Wars. The chances are very big that it's one of those two. I mean, there are other science fiction series that are influential, but those two are extremely dominant. And so this brings us to the problem that we have to realize that our imagination is always colonized. In this particular example, our colonization is colonized by the American movie industry. It's a very particular view of looking at our future in space. It's a very particular American view of looking at our future in space, which often has a kind of military foundation, which is a very particular way of building a society into the future. There is hardly any ecology present in most of those movies or episodes. So there are quite a number of things that you can recognize in this particular representation. So the question is really, how do we break away from that? And so what we did in the Evolving Asteroid Starships project, because that's what I wanted to introduce, is your challenge is interstellar space. The big problem of interstellar space is that it's unpredictable. A lot of space is unpredictable, but interstellar space is uniquely unpredictable because of its massive scale. When we were designing trips to the moon, it's Apollo 11 that landed on the moon's surface. All those missions before gradually went closer and closer to the moon, but each time they went back to Earth, the lessons learned were incorporated in the design, in the mission design, and the spacecraft design. And then the next trip would go a little further. So there's a gradual exploration of uncertainty until they touch the surface of the moon. You cannot use this when you're in interstellar travel. You can't go a little interstellar, go all the way back to Earth to fix a few things, go back. It would take you centuries to get anywhere. So this is a conundrum for engineers. How do you design a system that is supposed to be traveling an environment which is very hard to grasp or predict? And you can't even properly imagine it, because there's so little data. There is a bit of data. The Voyagers are sending a bit of data, but there's very little information about it. So you can hardly imagine it. How on earth do you do that, right? I came up with the idea, let's try and find a design for a spacecraft that evolves over time, that grows and evolves over time. That was the basic concept, the premise. But there was no vision. There was no idea, there was no sketch, there was nothing. It was just a concept. And then I pulled together a team of fellow researchers and students at TU Delft, and we started exploring. And gradually, this concept became a particular vision, got a particular shape. And that's where we ended up today. We have a pretty well-defined concept now. Some of the visualizations have been published by the European Space Agency. I'm wrapping up the latest versions of the computer models so we can publish the results. So gradually over time, we made that concept more and more specific. We started visualizing it. We started turning it into a particular computer model so we could run these experiments with it to explore the consequences of those choices.
I'm super, super interested in whether imagination can function as a guide to epistemic possibility, maybe through design, for example. And you said we had very little data. So the framework of the imagination was very constrained. Mm-hmm. So how did you implement this data and came to this possibility of interstellar travel?
Yeah, that's because in modeling, you're narrowing down. We do not claim to build a full-scale realistic model, including all details of that starship. We decided to focus, and that's what every model does. We decided to focus on particular aspects. So, for example, we do not include propulsion. We're not working on propulsion. There are many other people working on advanced propulsion systems for spacecraft to travel beyond the solar system and to the outer reaches of the solar system. So we started reducing our scope, and within that scope, you can make some educated guesses and some assumptions that are really based on the little available data that are there. There is really a difference in modeling. There is predictive modeling, which is really trying to make a digital twin of the world in order for you to explore new scenarios that you imagined but haven't happened in the world yet. And then you put them into the model and you explore the consequences of that to get real world data. For systems management, this is really crucial. That's not what we are doing. We're not doing predictive modeling. We're doing exploratory modeling. That's an entirely different field. In exploratory modeling, you're not trying to get to, how to put it, exact particular predictions of where the system will be at a certain point of time. You're much more focused on what kind of behavior does the system display and what are the reasons of that behavior. And you're doing this because your imagination is way too limited. You just simply cannot imagine those dynamics. It's just humanly impossible. And that's because we're dealing with complex systems. And that's actually the field that I'm working in. So I'm approaching that challenge of interstellar exploration through a complex systems theory approach. It's an emergent system. So what we designed was a concept for a starship that actually starts from an asteroid that is traveling in space, redirecting the asteroid, then putting robotics on the asteroid that gradually mine the interior of the asteroid. And then you use those mined materials to 3D print the actual spaceship architecture inside and outside of the asteroid. And so the hybrid structure, the combination of the original asteroid with that 3D printed architecture becomes the spacecraft. This idea of transforming an asteroid into a spacecraft is nothing new. It's present in science fiction, in a lot of computer games, for example, you can find this back. But we are really taking this whole idea a step further, and we're actually creating scientific computer models to explore the consequences of such a system and what kind of interactions are to be expected if you allow a system like this to develop itself and to adapt over time. So we're building a computer model in which we can run simulations, and we can run simulations that represent different types of journeys. We can create a virtual space journey with virtual challenges and then just start it in motion and then see what happens and see how the system evolves and behaves. And that's where human imagination, you just can't do this. This is way beyond a thought experiment. So it's like a thought experiment on steroids, right? Yeah. That's why I'm so passionate about this, because I've always been very, very interested in emergence. And so this is a huge contrast with the topic we're talking about today, imagination. Most of my work is really embracing emergence on a social, technical, and biological level. The Biomod project that I just talked about is exactly the same. There is never a plan for Biomod. We go to a community, we have this basic concept, recycling e-waste, integrating ecosystems, but there is no shape or form. And then over time, as a group, we gradually find and develop the form that emerges out of the interactions of the group. And so I can never imagine. I can only imagine very short term, like when we're actually in the process of making the next step in the development of the project, like maybe we could move this part here in the installation, or maybe we can remove this part. But the longer term imagination is quite impossible because you're opening up to being surprised by the end result.
Wow, thank you. Really inspiring. And speaking about picturing and simulations, as mentioned before, you're also part of the Mars simulation program of NASA, a commander, if I'm correct, right?
I was crew commander of the first high seas mission, yes.
Yes. I talked to the Chill Ice mission crew members. We talked about the role of imagination in these kind of simulations. How would you describe the role of imagination in analog astronaut missions? And why are analog astronaut missions important?
Just like in the computer simulations that I talked about before, in analog missions are also simulations. You never will simulate everything of a mission. You will never simulate an entire Mars experience in every single detail. You will always focus on something. So there are different analog programs, analog mission programs, and each program focuses on different aspects. The High Seas program is very much focused on individual psychology and group dynamics. It's really the social and psychological effects of long-term isolations of small crews living under a relatively high pressure. And other analog missions will be focused more on testing hardware, for example. So analog missions are really crucial because they offer a very immediate way to test ideas, to test strategies, to test equipment, and to understand the challenges that are ahead. I mean, if you would not use analog missions, it would become almost impossible to test different things because it would just be so expensive for each test to send people to the moon. So analog missions are really key and crucial in space exploration. And even astronauts during their training are doing a lot of analog work. Simulated missions as if they were on the moon and then testing equipment. This started in the Apollo era. So analog testing is just in the DNA of space exploration and training and development. Now, interesting part is that when you're in the middle of an analog space mission, part of the experience is very real and part of the experience is pretense. And the interesting thing is that for the latter, just imagining that you're on Mars, you need to constantly drive and use your imagination. I remember, just to give you an example, you're sitting in the high seas habitat on a Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. It's obviously not Mars, but the geology is like 95% like the geology on Mars. So if you look down, you could be on Mars, But of course, if you look up, you see the blue sky, a bird flies over. Well, that's not really Mars. And then you have to use your imagination to pretend you're on Mars. And what I felt is that this constant challenge and the suspension of disbelief, it's a constant battle. You really want to be on Mars. You really want to be there. You really want to experience something that is as close as really experiencing Mars, but reality is just reality on Earth. It's constantly reminding you, like, listen, forget it. You're not on Mars. There are animals and plants around here. And it's actually quite interesting how it becomes a bit of a battle. I remember in the beginning of my experience in high seas, we're all in a honeymoon phase. So the first 2 weeks are really easy. You're all super excited. But then reality starts to creep in. I remember I started getting a little irritated by, I wish the interior was a little more like a real space station. It doesn't really look like a space station. Most of the furniture came either from Walmart or IKEA. And you start to get annoyed by this. You really want high fidelity. And it's, of course, like I said, any analog mission is only simulating certain aspects of the real experience because they're only interested in certain research goals. So that's something that I took away from that experience.
Speaking about real experiences, you're aiming for the real experience because you applied to the ESA call for new astronauts. Why did you apply?
Well, I've always been interested in space. And of course, scientifically, just the idea of enabling scientific experimentation and scientific discovery in probably the most ultimate context for human beings to be in. I think that's just incredible. I'm deliberately talking about enabling scientific discovery and experimentation because as an astronaut, you're really in service of other people. You're not some autonomous hero who goes on his own exploring the universe. That's not how it works. Every astronaut is embedded in a massive community, and it's really so many people on Earth are depending on that astronaut. So, and that's really what I find very interesting. Of course, as a community-oriented person, I find that very interesting. It's a way to combine working with a large group of people, but at the same time doing this cutting-edge research in this extreme environment. Now, there is another motivation which goes beyond the science and engineering, and it's more of a cultural interest. By being an astronaut or working in human spaceflight in general, it's this unique position to be part of the next step of human civilization. I mean, we're already in space, of course, for a number of decades, but you can really feel we're transitioning to a new era where humanity will be much more present in space on a more consistent basis. Many countries are developing space programs. Several countries are developing human spaceflight programs. If you look at what China is doing, for example, and they recently launched a new space station. They're fully developing that. And that's just one of the nations that is interested in human spaceflight. But then there's also space tourism that is about to kickstart. It's quite controversial, billionaires setting up these space experiences. But apart from that aspect, it's interesting to see that space becomes much more habitable than ever before. And there's really a huge drive to move at least a little part of humanity into space. So being part of that conversation and being able to co-design that new stage of human civilization is also huge. And I think being an astronaut is kind of an ultimate position to be able to do that.
Wow, thank you. And maybe to conclude this interview, this podcast, if we want to join your community, where can we find you? And maybe do you have any reading suggestions or maybe film tips to feed our imagination?
Of course. Our SEADS network can be found on our website, which is seads.network. It's pretty easy, SEADS.network. You can find me on the major social media. And I have some suggestions because you asked me before and I was thinking about a few suggestions. So I have a little list here. For reading, there's a whole range of science fiction that I like. I'm not going to give you a long list, but there are two books that stand out. It's The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin, which is a phenomenal Chinese science fiction novel, very famous. If you haven't read it before and you're interested in imagination, you should totally read this book because it really shifts your ideas on how science fiction could look like, talking about breaking through paradigms and having different cultural perspectives. It's a good example of that. Another really interesting book is The Player of Games by Ian Banks. It's part of the larger and very interesting culture series. It's also a phenomenal book, a science fiction book set in the future, and it has gaming and games. I'm not talking about computer games, but gaming in general as a core theme, but in an incredibly interesting way. It's kind of connected to politics, and it's a very, very surprising book. I'm also reading astronaut books. right now. Because of my application for the ESA astronaut call, I've been reading the Astronaut Selection Test Book by Tim Peake. And it's actually a very hands-on practical book written by an astronaut on what it entails to go through the selection process of ESA. And it's just very informative. It's a very nicely written book. And then I think my favorite astronaut book up to date is the one by Michael Collins. He was one of the 3 astronauts to go to the moon, but the book is called Carrying the Fire. And it's a wonderful journey through his life and how he became one of the first astronauts to go to the moon. It's a beautiful book. But I'm also interested in podcasts, not just books. And the podcasts that I've been listening to for quite a while, and I'm still listening to, the first one is 99% Invisible. It's a design podcast. It's not classic design. It's really about how ordinary things are made, and mostly the history and the politics behind ordinary objects, a lot of ordinary objects or phenomena. It's very interesting. And another one is called The Memory Palace. And The Memory Palace is a beautiful podcast about little snippets of history. It's very American-centered, but nevertheless, it's a joy to listen to, which brings me to my interest in history. I love history. I can't get enough of history. And I'm a futurist. My practice is really thinking about the future, the deep future. But I think you can only do that by really engaging with history and trying to see what kind of dynamics have happened in the past and try to extrapolate. And that brings me to a series that I'm currently watching, which is a couple of years old. It's The Last Kingdom, about the Viking incursions in England. And I've actually discovered so much of the history of England that I had no idea about. And I find it tremendously interesting. And I can keep going on. It's all science fiction, history. Those are my big topics. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. I will make sure to place links underneath the podcast on the website. And I really want to thank you, Angelo, for this wonderful conversation and wishing you all the best in your endeavor to become an astronaut. And
let's see.
Yes, let's see. And keep us posted. Thank you.
You're welcome.
For more information, links and show notes, visit scientificimagination.org.